Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Brainstorming last week about what we were going to talk about this week because we thought it was potentially going to be quiet, but then the next tropical system is possible and it's moving over the state today. Welcome to the Streaming Center, Tracking the Tropics. I'm meteorologist Rebecca Berry here at WFLA, and joining us, meteorologist Juliana Mejia. Am I mispronouncing your name, Juliana?
That's okay. Mejia.
Mejia, thank you.
Halfway there.
Well, I got about halfway here, and you should know that we're like a couple of weeks into this, so I feel like I've mangled it every single time, so I apologize. I'm going to practice off air next time. We won't do that again. And we have a special guest joining us for the first time on Tracking the Tropics.
Hello.
Meteorologist Carly Ritter. How are you?
I'm landlocked and doing great.
I love that. That's right. You're coming to us from Kansas City, right?
Correct. Kansas City, Missouri, but a Florida girl born and raised. So lived there my entire life, went to school in Florida, and now landlocked away from all the coastal fun that y'all get to have down there.
We might try to lure you back because you're no stranger to part of our market. You did a little time in Sarasota.
I did my first job out of school. I actually was in Sarasota and worked during the 2005 hurricane season. So I got to have all the fun.
Oh, Charlie Francis Jean.
Yep. Was having a great time doing all that stuff.
So now we know why you're in Kansas City.
2005. Seriously, I worked that year and went through the entire list of names plus the Greek alphabet started. And I was like, I'm good. I think I'm going to go somewhere else for a little bit.
Well, I want to remind everyone we are going to get to Juliana, and she's going to break down everything you need to know about this potential tropical cyclone that we're watching right here, even though it doesn't have any official designation yet. It's just an invest system, not really that closed low or any of the other characteristics. We'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to go ahead and let everyone watching know this is an interactive program, and we want to hear your questions. We want to hear your comments. We want to hear what you're thinking about this season's tropics. But in order for us to use your questions or comments, you do have to use our hashtag systems. So if you look below our names on the screen, you can see the hashtags. It's hashtag Hey Rebecca, hashtag Hey Juliana, or hashtag Hey Carly. If you use that hashtag in your comment, we'll be able to see them, we'll be able to bring them on screen, and we'll be able to address them and answer them. For now, Juliana, do we have to worry? What's going on?
Yeah, so taking a look at the latest regarding Tropical Wave Invest 93L, there's the latest spaghetti plots, where really at this point the expectation is that this is going to just keep sliding its way west over Florida here pretty much over the next few hours and emerge likely early tomorrow over into the Gulf. So that's why that blob is drawn that way, the X marking that relative area of low pressure. You made a good point that, this isn't a closed low. That's why it's just at this point an invest. And so when it does eventually work its way towards the Gulf. Again, now those spaghetti plots, some of them want this to stay over land, and that could then, the more land interaction prohibits potential organization and better development, but more of these than not are leaning towards this from going over open waters for some period of time, where very much the heat content of the ocean as well as just the sea surface temperatures alone are plenty warm for this to fuel this system to organize a little bit better. So as of right now, this looks to develop as potentially a tropical depression at the very least. Some of these models now are kind of getting a little more on board with potentially getting Tropical Storm Dexter out of this. There is an idea of the future wind gusts as this does more and more look to eyeball the north and central portions of the Gulf Coast heading into the middle and end of this week. So really going to be kind of watching this pretty closely, but one way or another, the forecast is really focused on the heavy rain. So there's just a friendly reminder, if we do get a name system out of this, the next name is Dexter. Now we're going to load in the rainfall forecast here. If I can get it to, maybe not. Okay, we'll give it a second, but essentially across Florida and over into much of the Gulf Coast and especially Louisiana, focus on a rainfall forecast here of anywhere between about 3 to upwards of 6 inches, with isolated areas looking to see potentially 7, 8 inches, potentially more. So we've already seen that. We've already been feeling the impacts here in the Bay Area in Florida with lots and lots of heavy rain the last 24, even 48 hours. And we're going to keep that up again today. And so here's a visual of that as well, where as we progress through the next day or so, heading into Wednesday, Thursday, all of that moisture slides across one way or another. Again, really emphasizing whether or not we get a named system out of this, it's going to be rather wet across the Gulf Coast. Then that looks to slide up into portions of Louisiana, potentially Mississippi. Now, then that's when dry air kind of gets swept in its wake across portions of Florida and then potentially into portions of Louisiana, eastern Texas as well. So that is the little bit of relief on the horizon for these areas, for our area as well. But in the meantime, there is quite a flooding potential. So we're under an elevated flood potential in our area for today. That's a level 2 out of 4. At least a level 1 continues and kind of sweeps across the Gulf Coast, and that bumps up to a level 2 heading into Thursday. Then Louisiana, level 3 out of 4 flooding potential for Friday, as again, the worst of the system then is bringing the heaviest rain and the continued impacts lingering into this weekend then, as just that rain kind of wraps up and lingers across that area into the weekend. So just an overview. Focus on the heavy rain, focus on the risk of flash flooding for Florida, northern and central parts of the Gulf Coast. This could be a tropical depression, could also potentially be Tropical Storm Dexter, and that's focused on today, pretty much all the way through Friday, with then those lingering impacts into the upcoming weekend. Really not going to see too much get in the way of whether this develops. I'm not really seeing anything in the way of Sahara dust across the Gulf, but it's just rather how much time, it's all dependent on how much time this spends over the very warm open waters. But I did want to go digging into this as to okay, why is it sliding from east to west and then it gets scooped up to the north? I think that high pressure and then extension of the Bermuda High kind of slides in from the east, and then all of that flow is what helps push this up into Louisiana heading into Friday and eventually Saturday as well. So hopefully that's a decent overview here, and I don't know if we wanted to bring in Carly for any thoughts you had on this, or is there anything in particular you wanted to chat about?
I mean, I think that all eyes are on the Gulf Coast, right? So it's been an interesting season thus far. I think there's a lot of people who are keeping an eye on things because this is, especially the rain aspect of it, because I think flooding and flash flooding in general is kind of like a very hot topic right now, with a lot of that happening around the country. And so I do think that regardless of if the winds reach tropical depression, tropical storm, whatever, it's a rainmaker, and that's going to have impacts one way or the other, especially for Louisiana. And we all know it's a low-lying area. We all know it's a coastal community that gets inundated very easily, very quickly by the heavy rain. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But that Gulf water is bathwater right now, and it hasn't really been kind of worked over, yet. We haven't had any systems in the Gulf really that have really impacted the water temp. So like you said, if it stays over the open waters, I would not be shocked if something more than just a depression were to kind of happen here. So it just, Dexter might be on the table very quickly here for Louisiana and the Gulf Coast in general.
And I was interested to hear what you guys had to say about this, because we had Barry and we had Chantal. They were both very weak systems. They were both very short-lived, but they each individually produced catastrophic flooding when they did move on land. Barry, of course, contributing to the flooding that we saw in Texas, Chantal, the flooding that we saw across parts of the Carolinas. And so with weaker systems, because the rain's not evenly distributed around that center, it's just not strong enough to kind of force that rain to circulate around that low pressure system. Is it almost more dangerous at this point if it stays weaker and we get that more slow moving rain over parts of Louisiana? Is this a more dangerous system if the winds don't pick up? And I think that's something that this season is really pointed out, that maybe, people get very cranky all the time about how many systems they do name. And I get it. It does seem like they name systems that don't have that much of an impact. But then when you look at the further reaching impact, some of these systems did some serious damage once they got inland.
I mean, think about some of the biggest rainmaking systems. Look at Allison, for instance, Wayback Machine, but that was one of the biggest rainmakers ever for a tropical system. And I think that a lot of these systems, as they move on shore and they don't have the wind tied to it or even a name necessarily tied to it, maybe people tend to relax a little bit or put their guard at a lower level just because they think, oh, it's not a wind issue. I don't have to board up. I don't have to evacuate. And then all of a sudden the flooding becomes the bigger problem. And as both of you know, living on a community that's surrounded by a bunch of water, there's a very easy, it happens quickly and it happens easily with these systems, especially when you're talking about a half a foot of rainfall. And that's just the total rain. That's not even including the runoff or other areas that have more flood prone, terrain. And so seeing a half of a foot or more potential rain with this system tied to it for Louisiana, maybe Mississippi, if it does go a little bit farther north instead of west as much, it is something that should be concerning for the residents along the coast, just because, like you said, the wind may not be the factor, but the rain could be. And ultimately, the rain could end up causing way bigger issues across the board because it's more widespread than just the confined stronger winds near the center of any circulation of any landfalling system. So I think that people need to pay attention to this one for sure, especially heading into the end of the week and the weekend.
And I think as a community, meteorology has done a great job of communicating the storm surge risk. I think a lot of people do evacuate that would not have otherwise evacuated without that knowledge. But I think the new risk to communicate is going to be the potential for flooding from rainfall, for inland flooding. I think that's what we have room to grow in communicating that risk and forecasting that risk, because it comes down to a matter of miles and a matter of minutes with those training storms. So I think that's where we have room to grow in the scientific community with not only forecasting that risk, but also communicating that.
It's unfortunate what has happened as of late with all the water rescues we've been hearing about. And I do feel like it's getting a lot more attention lately. But it is interesting to see how quickly conditions can change with flash flooding in general, or just flooding in general. And when you have a Gulf moisture system that's just flowing in storm after storm in that training rain, it happens very quickly. And then you find yourself in a situation where you're like, I can't leave because I've literally become an island in my home or wherever you're situated. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I do think if it takes a little bit more of a jaunt around that high and stays over the open waters like you were showing right now, I wouldn't be shocked if we're talking about Dexter before the end of the week,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're all on the same page there. We do have a couple of viewer questions and comments coming in, so I want to remind our viewers, if you'd like to ask us a question or just comment on what we're talking about here and weigh in on your thoughts, you do have to use the hashtag for us to be able to see it. You can see it just under our names, hashtag Hey Rebecca, hashtag Hey Juliana, or hashtag Hey Carly. And so we're going to kick it off. We have a couple of hashtags coming in right now. And so ask a question and we will answer it. This question coming in from R.A. Soria, hashtag Hey Rebecca, how is Citrus County looking in Inverness? And so when we were talking about a lot of these systems, it does come down to how close that low tracks to us. And also as far as just by county, it does look like there will be a little bit more rain in our northern counties. So areas like Citrus would be prone to some of the heavier rain. When I was looking at the forecast yesterday for today, it did look like somewhere between Citrus and Pasco, so Citrus, Hernando, Pasco, maybe even northern Pinellas, was going to get some pretty consistent rain as this low traverses the state, just because of the positioning of where the rain is centered, or basically going around that low pressure system. And so I do think we're probably going to see the potential for some flooding. I can't say for certain it's going to be Inverness, but you are more prone the further north you go for some significant rain for today. Now, the good news is that low pressure system pulls away from us. It'll still drag some trails of tropical moisture across our state, but it's going to be nothing like what the more concentrated rain that's moving over our area today. So that's the good news. All right, we got another one coming in. Hashtag Hey Rebecca. How much rain is expected in Plant City today and tomorrow? And Carly, just to bring you in, we got about 8 to 10 inches of rain in this one little town yesterday with the thunderstorm, and it was just awful. And so areas just in southern Plant City, they got a really big hot spot of rain that just sat there. Basically, a little meso low developed over that area, and it just rained and rained and rained and would not stop. And so Plant City today, not looking for any, there's no reason that you would get an excessive amount of rain today like you did yesterday. It looks like it might even be just a little to the north of Plant City where we do get the heavier rain today. So that is the good news. And I am hoping that you guys are drying out and cleaning up, because I know that was just such a mess yesterday. All right, this one's going towards Hey Juliana. Hashtag Hey Juliana, how fast is it tracking right now? And so it's on the move. It's got a little decent speed to it, huh?
Yeah, it's been kind of, I want to say picking up over the last little bit, but I mean, it's been rain. I'm not going to lie. It's been raining over Daytona down through Orlando. I'm looking at it on my map down here, all morning. So it's kind of, I want to say, honestly, it's kind of been dragging a little bit. And I think through the next few hours, through the second half of today is when we're going to finally see it actually traverse from the East Coast to the West Coast. But honestly, it's been kind of taking its sweet time for the last little bit now to work its way into the East Coast. And so we're now just seeing, barely some of that light rain kind of coming into our northern counties at the moment. But we're still going to be holding off until it's 12:46 right now for another few hours before we start to see it develop a little bit more and then really see the heavier rain slide through this area, the Bay Area later
Especially
on.
with weak systems like this, you never really know how it's going to behave with the friction over the land. Like you never really know until it spits back out into the Gulf. This thing could be a nothing, or it could, once again, like we all have a feeling, end up being Dexter. So moving on. And so I'm going to toss this one out to the team, even though it's #Hey Rebecca. What should Mobile expect? And so Mobile's kind of on the edge of it there. And this is going to come down to which kind of side of the spaghetti tracks the system takes you guys.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up the spaghetti tracks here. This, I think, really is just focusing on the rainfall. And I think, like we talked a little bit, I think, last week, too, is, and I know this viewer isn't necessarily asking about whether or not it'll be a named system or not, but expect a lot of rain and plan accordingly and keep a close eye on your local forecast, because I'll actually pull up the flooding potential and kind of like there is a low end risk for flooding starting tomorrow, and that pretty much carries over throughout the week, Thursday over into Friday as well, and then potentially still through this upcoming weekend. So it's going to be very, very persistent. And I think, as we've been talking about, there's no underestimating flooding from rainfall. And I was going to mention this earlier, and I don't know necessarily the geography of that area, what the rivers are like, and clearly what now we've seen with river flooding, and even locally, there's a flood warning for DeSoto County for the Horse Creek. So some, creeks having flooding issues. With my experience, Hurricane Ian having been, like we're talking about, potentially a slow-moving system, or whether or not it's slow-moving, just all the rain associated with these systems when it's raining for days on end, this being an example, whether or not this is a named storm, that's going to pose a serious threat. With Hurricane Ian, we had inland flooding from freshwater flooding with our local rivers and creeks that was I think it was 26 inches of rainfall in those areas within the period of Ian sliding through. It was at a snail's pace. This was like an 8-9 mile per hour storm, and there were boats. There were water evacuations. People riding their boats over roadways because they were so flooded. And I'm not saying that's what's going to be the case here, but it's just to emphasize that freshwater flooding is a serious issue and something to take seriously, and that's what in areas like Mobile, I'd be planning on and expecting flooding.
I think what's interesting also is, the high is going to be kind of steering this in a not so traditional path going from, the east to west. You had mentioned that earlier of why it was going in that direction or why it was taking that path. What's interesting, though, is when it does finally pivot around the west side and starts moving to the north, that's where I think I'm a little concerned, just because it does make a pretty decent jaunt from Wednesday to Friday to get from essentially Florida to Louisiana. But then it kind of just gets stuck there, and we have a front coming through here on Thursday, and hopefully that would kind of kick things out a little bit, maybe make a little bit of movement. But if we miss that momentum of that front, you're literally relying on that high pressure to steer that. And that's where I think that potential, you were highlighting Mobile and Louisiana and that circled area right now. We're talking Thursday, there was at least some sort of a risk for flooding. Friday, there was a risk for flooding. Even Saturday, you still had at least a level 2 out of 5 risk for flooding. And so it kind of loses its forward momentum. And that's where you start to get the big issues, because you're going to have that onshore flow, all the moisture streaming in from the Gulf. You have the low trying to turn around the high. It just screams to me big rain event, regardless of how much or how little wind. It just the setup is there, right? And eventually it'll get kicked out around that high pressure. But
and you make a really good point too, because something I was digging for when I was kind of looking, I was like, okay, why is it? And I'm kind of going back and forth here with the timeline, because the jet stream is so far to the north. We don't have the jet stream to scoop this up and
it's
to
not
pick
picking
up
it
the
up.
pace.
Yeah.
So we are stuck with this really lax mid and upper level flow, and who knows even how organized this may or may not be. Like we're talking about, it's almost like there is a heightened threat with this being less organized or on the weaker side, because then it's not as strong or as tall of a system to then
And it can't get
scooped
picked up.
by the
Right.
mid and upper level flow. So that is, then you're stuck with this really weak low level flow, which I think is also part of the reason why at the moment it's kind of dragging its feet over portions of Florida, because there's no wind
Nothing to
to
steer.
get it going anywhere.
Right.
So you
Yeah,
make a
it's
really good
interesting.
point.
It'll be interesting also. All of my family is still in Florida, mostly East Coast, DeLand specifically. And literally yesterday, my mom texted me. She goes, I just have this weird feeling that the tropics are about to really heat up. And then obviously we have this invest area. And it has been a fairly quiet season because, like you both mentioned, all the storms that we've had named so far have been very short duration events or very weak events. So we haven't heard a lot, or they happened on a holiday weekend, or, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks as we get through the month of July, August, obviously September being the peak of the season. So I don't want people to kind of write off this season yet. You know what I'm saying? So it'll be interesting to see as things ramp up as we wrap up the month of July, back half of July. And like I said at the top of the show, I just worry when I see 86 degrees in the Gulf. You show that graphic, it's warm. It's very, very warm. So
absolutely. And then another point is Floridians get really worried about tornadoes within tropical systems, because we don't see a big risk of tornadoes very often. But when a tropical system rolls through, that's exactly what Harley Stevens is worried about. What is the risk for tornadoes and where? And so we had a tornado warning yesterday. It looked very sound on the radar, and I do expect the report to come back that it was probably an EFC or an EF1, which is pretty rare for us. We're a waterspout town. And so I don't think that the risk is much more elevated today than it was yesterday for us in Florida, but I do think the risk of tornadoes along the Panhandle and along the Gulf Coast, if the system does manage to get a little bit more organized, will be an issue, especially with this atypical movement of the storm moving from east to west. What do you guys think?
You go ahead.
Agree.
Yeah,
I was going to say
that's a fair assessment.
Anytime you have a landfalling system, even if it's just a water spout, and then these bands are moving so quickly, if you do have a more organized system, that very quickly it goes from a water spout on land, and then that's where you run into some of those pockets of much stronger destruction, devastation in areas. And it's very isolated though, because it's unique to those individual little cells that are making landfall. So
we've also
hopefully not.
I know. I hope not too. We've got a question. This goes back to your risk levels. How bad is a level 3 rain risk? And so Juliana was showing that earlier. So I'm going to let her pull that back up and explain this risk threat.
Yeah. So this is level 3. I'm pulling this up right now from the WPC just to give you a literal definition, because I don't want to misspeak in any way. So a level 3 means a moderate, in this case, is at least a 40% risk of rainfall exceeding flash flood guidance within 25 miles of that shaded area. So it's a significant risk. And as you see when we're sliding through, it's not also all that common. I can't necessarily say that completely statistically speaking across the United States, but in this especially scenario in particular, there is only a small area that they're highlighting for that level 3, only one day out of this entire week. So I do think that says a lot, and especially 40%. The verbiage I saw and the wording from the National Weather Service is there is high confidence that this is going to be a very heavy rainfall event and in a way, a problematic rainfall event, but there's less confidence in the actual rainfall accumulation numbers. They put out, I think, for portions of the north central Gulf Coast, Louisiana, upwards of, I think, a safe numbers that they were using was like 3 to 6 inches. But they did mention that in a reasonable worst case scenario, there could be 8 to 10 inches of rainfall in these areas, which I think is going to be focused on that red shaded area.
All right. And our last one before we have to go for the day, we're going to toss this one toward Carly. Hey, do you think it could be a hurricane? What do you think?
TJ, I don't think so. I don't think we have enough time. I think that it'll be a little too close to land, maybe a little friction there. If it were to be a southern peninsula low and then it went into the Gulf, I might be a little more concerned. I just don't think we're going to have enough time for it to be away from land and over water for a long enough period to hit hurricane strength. Could it be a tropical storm? I wouldn't be shocked at all. But to get to hurricane strength, I'm not overly confident at all. I don't think that'll be an issue.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Carly. This was a first for us to have you on our program. We certainly enjoyed it. We loved hearing from our landlocked friend.
The Floridian at heart. I will never not love hurricanes, but it was lovely to be a part of your show today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And Juliana, thank you so much for your expertise as always. She builds all the graphics and does all the heavy lifting for this. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. We may hop on tomorrow or the next day if this does become Dexter, just to give you some updates. So we're always here in WFLA Streaming Center. We're always here tracking the tropics as well. If nothing happens, we won't see you until next week at this time. But if something happens, we will pop on here live from the WFLA Streaming Center and tell you everything you need to know. Thanks once again for joining us, guys.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.